Upon his passing in 1945, the infamous dictator left behind not merely a shattered regime, but also a familial inheritance, severely overshadowed by deep denial, profound silence, and intensely unresolved disputes. Decades later, his direct bloodline existed under heavily altered identities within the United States, completely distanced from any public spotlight. Among them was Howard, a dedicated federal tax investigator who was the sole individual to voice a yearning to build a family. His passing in 1989, at the tender age of 32, following a tragic mishap while on active duty, irrevocably severed the ultimate biological opportunity to extend the direct lineage. His moniker was honorably etched into the official governmental memorials of the United States, yet his personal narrative remained firmly locked behind closed doors of strict confidentiality. Concurrently, fierce debates regarding the dictator's immense wealth dominated judicial courts and historical archives for countless decades. Global investigations pointed toward the existence of heavily encrypted Swiss bank accounts, lucrative image rights, and immense capital derived from his notorious political manifesto, which, if adjusted to modern economic valuation, would exceed 4,600 million euros. Nevertheless, the Bavarian state firmly obstructed any financial claims, citing the comprehensive confiscation of all assets connected to that dark era. The judicial system completely dismissed even the formal legal petitions filed by acknowledged relatives, such as his sister Paula or his nephew Leo Raubal. This comprehensive documentary thoroughly investigates the historical realities surrounding the destiny of this dark lineage and the concealed repercussions of a surname that countless individuals desperately attempted to erase from memory. The early developmental years of the future dictator were intensely shaped by the overbearing presence of his patriarch, Alois. Brought into the world in 1837 in a modest village within Lower Austria, born out of wedlock to a humble domestic worker, Alois relentlessly clawed his way up the bureaucratic ladder of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until he secured the prestigious title of customs inspector. This hard-won triumph, which he viewed as undeniable proof of his inherent superiority, deeply convinced him that absolute order, unquestioning obedience, and rigid discipline were the non-negotiable cornerstones of true success. He ruthlessly applied this exact same philosophy to his domestic sphere without a single ounce of nuance. Behind closed doors, Alois was an unforgiving, easily provoked man, highly prone to administering harsh physical discipline, possessing remarkably little patience for both his wife and his offspring. He directed a particularly sharp hostility toward his son, whom he fiercely intended to mold into a loyal civil servant, entirely dismissing the boy's artistic passions and his notably poor academic performance. The boy did not openly rebel against his patriarch. Instead, he embraced a strategy of quiet, passive resistance. He blatantly ignored the heavy expectations placed upon him, displayed a remarkably defiant attitude within the classroom, and was forced to repeat an academic year during his adolescence. This behavioral pattern can be easily interpreted as a muted form of rebellion against an overbearing authority figure he simply could not challenge face to face. As the years rolled by, he would look back on his father as an incredibly difficult man to comprehend, someone he never truly learned to love, yet whose looming shadow commanded both deep respect and lingering fear. The demise of Alois in 1903, when his son was a mere 13 years old, marked a monumental turning point. On one hand, it eradicated a ceaseless source of psychological pressure, but simultaneously, it stripped him of a male guiding force during a highly crucial chapter of his personal development. The profound void created by the loss of Alois was partially filled by the incredibly close bond he shared with his mother, Klara. A woman characterized by her gentle, submissive nature and deeply ingrained religious beliefs, Klara dedicated her entire existence to nurturing her household and protecting her children. Following the heartbreaking loss of several infants, she cultivated an unusually tight-knit connection with her surviving son. In stark contrast to the unyielding harshness of the patriarch, Klara provided boundless understanding, warm affection, and absolutely unconditional support. She stood as the solitary figure who actively encouraged him to chase his personal creative dreams, even when those ambitions directly clashed with the lingering ghost of his father's demands. Once widowed, Klara swiftly evolved into her son's primary emotional anchor. However, this fragile stability was violently shattered in 1907, when she received a devastating terminal medical diagnosis. Throughout her agonizing battle with illness, she was treated by an incredibly devoted physician who would later vividly recall the young man's absolute, unwavering dedication to his ailing mother. He was an incredibly attentive youth, fully prepared to sacrifice everything to ease her immense physical suffering. Klara's tragic passing in December of that exact same year left him profoundly, irreparably shattered. He was merely 18 years of age, and this catastrophic emotional blow would haunt his spirit for the remainder of his days. He consistently spoke of her using words dripping with reverence, forever portraying her as the solitary soul he ever genuinely loved. From that pivotal moment forward, the foundational structure of his family began to rapidly disintegrate. Communication with his younger sibling, Paula, grew increasingly sporadic and emotionally distant. Despite being the only two offspring of Klara and Alois to successfully reach adulthood, their interpersonal dynamic remained remarkably frigid and painfully superficial. After finally departing the family residence in 1908, he would not cross paths with her again for well over a decade. When they eventually re-established contact, their meetings were exceptionally rare and strictly formal. As he relentlessly consolidated his terrifying public persona, the rising leader exerted massive effort to sever every conceivable tie to his humble, familial roots. He aggressively blocked any journalistic attempts to delve into his ancestral origins, strategically utilizing the vast resources of the state apparatus to obliterate any highly inconvenient historical traces. One glaringly obvious example was the forced evacuation and destruction of entire rural settlements, such as the ancestral village where his forebears had resided, cleverly disguised under the convenient pretext of conducting military training exercises. Modern historians universally agree that this was a meticulously calculated operation, designed specifically to wipe out any revealing biographical evidence. Through these drastic measures, he successfully crafted a heavily sanitized official narrative, presenting himself as a flawless mythical figure, entirely disconnected from a family tree deeply rooted in crushing poverty, utter insignificance, and perpetual failure. During the chaotic final days of April in 1945, the fallen leader sought absolute refuge deep within his heavily fortified subterranean bunker in the heart of Berlin. On the 29th of April, he entered into matrimony with his longtime companion. The very next day, they both made the irreversible decision to meet their ultimate demise. She consumed a highly lethal chemical compound, while he brought about his own sudden end. Following his strict final directives, the remains were swiftly consigned to the flames to ensure they would never fall into the hands of advancing adversarial forces. This grim final act definitively sealed the catastrophic collapse of his brutal regime and further deepened the profound isolation of his surviving relatives. Following the fall of the notorious leader, the bloodline surprisingly endured, hidden deep within the shadows of absolute anonymity. In the quiet suburbs of Long Island, New York, three distinct brothers, Alexander Lewis and Brian Stewart Houston, chose to navigate their existence, operating beneath carefully fabricated identities, purposefully burying their true heritage. They were the direct offspring of William Patrick, a man who was the biological nephew of the notorious Dictator, a child born from his half-brother's second matrimonial union. From a remarkably young age, these three men solidified an incredibly resolute decision. None of them would ever bring children into this world. They never documented this profound vow on paper, nor did they formally sign any binding legal contract, but among them thrived an unspoken, utterly unbreakable pact. The underlying rationale was crystal clear. They vehemently refused to allow any future generations to shoulder the crushing, agonizing burden of an incredibly dark history they did not write, yet could never truly erase. Each of them matured fully aware of the incredibly heavy surname they kept desperately concealed. They profoundly understood that exposing this truth could instantly condemn them to a life plagued by constant suspicion, transform them into prime targets for symbolic retribution, or thrust them into a blinding public spotlight they desperately wished to avoid at all costs. One of the most heartbreakingly delicate situations arose when the romantic partner of one brother openly expressed her profound yearning to start a family. Their romantic bond appeared incredibly solid and profoundly genuine, yet a massive, unrevealed secret loomed overhead. Her beloved partner's true surname was heavily tied to history's darkest chapter. To further complicate this incredibly tragic scenario, the young woman carried Jewish heritage, making her dream of building a family even more emotionally complex. Ultimately, relying on the accounts of an incredibly close familial confidant, they collectively resolved to unveil the devastating truth. The immediate fallout was absolutely catastrophic. Shortly after this revelation, their romantic entanglement completely collapsed. A remarkably identical tragedy unfolded when another brother initiated a passionate romance with a woman of Puerto Rican descent. She, too, remained blissfully ignorant of her lover's deeply controversial ancestral past. Once she was gently informed that entering into matrimony meant, in practical terms, adopting the most reviled surname in modern history, the agonizing cycle repeated itself. The romantic bond was instantly severed. Beyond the constant, terrifying dread of being publicly ostracized, the heaviest burden was the paralyzing fear that their carefully guarded secret would completely upend their remarkably peaceful daily routines within a quiet, unassuming community in the northeastern United States. They had grown up in an idyllic environment where they were solely recognized by their adopted aliases, perfectly woven into the mundane, quiet rhythm of small-town American life. Exposing their true ancestral identity threatened to catastrophically derail the peaceful trajectory of their respective lives. For many long years, the individuals who intimately knew William Patrick never perceived him as a deeply sinister or highly controversial figure. To his neighbors, he was merely a deeply devoted family man, incredibly attentive, profoundly dedicated to his beloved wife and his boys, a man who actively sought to completely vanish from the societal radar following the devastating global conflict. The very last occasion he was officially referenced by his original controversial name occurred in the freezing month of February in 1946, upon receiving his honorable discharge from naval service at a military installation in Massachusetts. From that precise moment forward, he effectively evaporated from the official historical chronicles, seamlessly transitioning into a remarkably concealed and meticulously protected existence. Following his departure from the armed forces in 1946, still officially documented under his birth name, he virtually vanished from all public civilian records. Federal intelligence agencies had briefly noted in a classified internal memorandum that he was temporarily stationed in Rhode Island, patiently awaiting his final military separation. According to deeply trusted associates, during his active deployment, he sustained severe injuries while engaged in intense combat operations, struck by flying debris in his lower extremities. While no easily accessible official military documentation immediately verifies these specific claims, his close acquaintances vehemently insisted that he had honorably fulfilled his patriotic obligations and actively shunned any public accolades. During those exact same transitional months, he vocalized a strong desire to relocate back to the bustling metropolis of New York, to reunite with his fiercely protective mother, Bridget, and successfully finalize his legal naturalization to become an official citizen of the United States. Simultaneously, and perhaps while patiently enduring the bureaucratic delays of his citizenship processing, he bravely returned to the world of higher education. He officially enrolled at a prominent municipal college in New York, where he successfully earned an esteemed academic degree focusing on the complex social sciences. Sometime later, he bravely advanced into a rigorous graduate-level academic program at a similar prestigious institution, heavily concentrating on incredibly demanding subjects such as advanced economics, complex legal studies, intricate accounting principles, and the Spanish language. He diligently persevered through 4 rigorous academic semesters, but ultimately withdrew from the intensive program prior to achieving his final graduation. In the crisp month of October of that very same year, he officially applied for his federal Social Security documentation utilizing a cleverly modified, incredibly safe identity, William Hiller. This subtle alphabetical alteration was far from a random coincidence. It powerfully symbolized the definitive dawn of an entirely fresh chapter, deliberately leaving behind any lingering public association with his deeply controversial ancestral surname. The subsequent year, he entered into a deeply committed matrimony with Phyllis, a lovely young woman of German descent, whom he had briefly encountered during the turbulent decade of the 1930s, back when he maintained a friendly relationship with her brother overseas. Following the conclusion of the catastrophic global conflict, this fragile connection was successfully rekindled. Her brother, deeply terrified by the increasingly volatile geopolitical climate gripping the European continent, desperately pleaded with him to fiercely protect his beloved sister if he could successfully manage to transport her to the safety of the United States. This heartfelt plea was honored, and their initial platonic dynamic slowly blossomed into an incredibly stable, lifelong romantic bond. Phyllis, exactly 12 years his junior, seamlessly assimilated into her new American reality. Slowly but surely, the newlywed couple deliberately distanced themselves from any lingering public scrutiny. His profound dedication to completely erasing his turbulent past extended far beyond a mere legal adjustment of his surname. After exchanging sacred vows, he quietly settled down alongside his new wife and his aging mother, initially residing in a bustling urban borough before eventually relocating to a remarkably serene, heavily wooded neighborhood in Long Island, incredibly far removed from the chaotic urban noise and highly intrusive, curious gazes. Although certain acquaintances whispered that their union might have initially sparked as a practical legal mechanism to guarantee her permanent residency status, the undeniable truth remains that their profound bond ultimately solidified into a genuinely unbreakable family unit, over time, paving the way for a resilient and enduring partnership. With a growing household and the heavy duty of providing for his loved ones, the nephew took on various roles within the healthcare sector, capitalizing on the practical skills he had acquired during his naval service. He initiated his civilian career as a clinical assistant in a private urological practice located in Manhattan, subsequently transitioning to an administrative position within the urology ward of a prominent metropolitan medical center, widely believed to be Bellevue. Later on, he also secured employment at a state-run facility situated in Long Island. Throughout those passing years, he fully embraced a meticulously crafted new identity, deliberately chosen to sever any conceivable tie to his infamous uncle, his ancestral lineage, or even his mother's maiden heritage. The fictitious family moniker they adopted stemmed, quite ironically, from a prominent British intellectual whose ideologies had subtly influenced the racial dogmas of the very regime they fled. It was a profound historical irony that very few could have ever deciphered. The relocation to Long Island was far from a random choice. In that quiet suburb, the couple desperately sought the protective shield of absolute anonymity. The father deeply yearned for his boys to mature entirely free from the crushing stigma of their dark ancestry, completely detached from any direct association with his notorious relative. To ensure this outcome, he imposed a relentlessly strict mandate. He would never utter a single word about the dictator in any public setting. This solemn vow of absolute silence was not solely rooted in his profound personal disgust for his relative. It was heavily driven by a very real terror of violent retaliation. During the initial phases of the global conflict, terrifying rumors circulated suggesting that high-ranking regime officials had dispatched loyal operatives across the Atlantic with explicit directives to permanently silence him, utilizing any necessary measures. While the absolute veracity of those sinister orders was never fully corroborated. The looming peril of being targeted by radical zealots remained a constant, terrifying shadow. As the years progressed, leveraging his extensive background in clinical medicine and laboratory protocols, he successfully established an independent diagnostic testing venture, primarily focusing on hematological evaluations. He dedicated exhaustingly long hours to his enterprise, while his devoted wife managed the domestic sphere and nurtured their children. In this quiet manner, step by step, they forged a remarkably ordinary existence on the absolute fringes of an extraordinarily dark historical narrative. The impenetrable isolation that safeguarded the family's secret identity in Long Island did not completely prevent historical echoes from resonating within the private walls of their home. Although the authentic surname was strictly forbidden in public spaces, and the offspring matured without grasping the full magnitude of their heritage, domestic silence was not entirely absolute. The patriarch would occasionally recount vivid memories from his turbulent tenure in Central Europe, such as partaking in afternoon tea with his infamous uncle at his opulent Alpine retreat. He vividly described how every single element surrounding the supreme leader was meticulously engineered to project an aura of overwhelming dominance. He spoke of flawlessly attired guests, ostentatious furnishings, and environments dripping with an almost theatrical level of opulence. Yet his personal assessment was unwaveringly sharp. He maintained that his relative had completely lost his moral compass amidst that intoxicating excess. That absolute authority had morphed him into a deeply delusional figure entirely incapable of perceiving true reality. These intimate recollections not only shaped his own understanding of the tyrannical regime, but also profoundly influenced his children's perspectives. From a very tender age, they comprehended that their father had made an incredibly courageous, irreversible choice to openly defy the dictator. He had adamantly rejected lucrative invitations to integrate into the upper echelons of the ruling party, even when enticed with promises of immense privilege upon the condition of relinquishing his British citizenship. According to his own accounts, a highly prominent deputy of the regime personally pressured him, insisting he owed a patriotic duty to the supreme leader to formally adopt the nation's citizenship, yet he stood firm in his refusal. He had chillingly realized that the monstrous apparatus his uncle was constructing fundamentally violated his own core moral compass. This bold, face-to-face rejection triggered his immediate forced exodus from the territory. He received a severe warning that if he did not vanish immediately, his physical safety would be critically compromised. Wasting no time, he hastily crossed the international border into the Netherlands, concealed within a companion's automobile, leaving the country behind forever. Many years later, when his boys had reached their adolescent years, he would cautiously reveal vintage photographs from that bygone era, snapshots capturing moments with prominent entertainers, gatherings with influential political figures, and fading mementos from his brief stint on the international lecturing circuit. Yet, transcending the mere recounting of historical anecdotes, the central prevailing lesson was the absolute necessity of severing all ties to the past, to utterly disown the surname, the bloodline, and any lingering connection to that tyrannical empire. His wife, conversely, navigated their self-imposed exile with a significantly deeper sense of emotional conflict. She managed to sustain discreet correspondence with her European relatives and occasionally journeyed across the ocean to visit them alongside her children whenever circumstances permitted. The profound sense of cultural uprooting caused her immense sorrow, yet she stoically accepted their reality. During the turbulent era marked by the Southeast Asian conflict, she grew utterly terrified that her own flesh and blood might be drafted into overseas combat, a paralyzing fear that propelled her to take remarkably drastic preventative actions. She successfully orchestrated a pathway for all of her sons to be officially ordained as men of the cloth within the Lutheran faith, effectively shielding them from the mandatory military conscription. The family's unyielding commitment to burying their true lineage occasionally escalated to almost unimaginable extremes. On one particularly terrifying evening, upon suddenly realizing that an external party had successfully unmasked their deeply guarded secret, they did not hesitate for a single second to permanently abandon their residence without offering the slightest prior notice. The individual who discovered them was not a mere innocent bystander, but someone they genuinely perceived as a tangible, imminent danger. Consequently, they vanished into the night, leaving practically all their worldly possessions behind. For this embattled family, preserving their anonymity was not merely a matter of social preference. It was a desperate, non-negotiable mechanism of basic survival. In the year 1987, the patriarch fell unexpectedly and severely ill. For several agonizing days, he battled a ravaging fever and a highly aggressive respiratory complication. He ultimately passed away at the age of 76. Remaining fiercely loyal to their lifelong principle of fading into the background, his surviving relatives initially contemplated laying him to rest without any identifying markers. However, after deep contemplation, they ultimately chose to inter his remains beside his beloved mother within a dedicated family plot, which also reserved a sacred resting place for his devoted widow. With his ultimate departure, the surviving sons embarked upon increasingly divergent life paths, despite sharing undeniably striking, unmistakable, ancestral facial features. The eldest sibling dedicated his compassionate energy to counseling veterans returning from overseas conflicts. The two middle brothers seamlessly took over the family's established horticultural and landscaping enterprise on Long Island, operating their business out of the very same residence where they had spent their formative years. None of them ever shattered the solemn family pact of silence, with the sole exception of the third brother, whose journey took an entirely independent trajectory. He boldly relocated to the bustling heart of Manhattan, entered into matrimony, and secured a highly demanding position as an investigative agent for the Federal Financial Oversight Department. From his earliest youth, he had consistently radiated a vibrant, intensely outgoing personality, standing in stark contrast to the deeply guarded, secretive nature of his siblings. Former classmates fondly remembered him as an exceptionally charismatic youth, deeply passionate about musical arts, highly active in competitive athletics, and boasting an incredibly impressive academic record. Within his local community, he was universally recognized as simply the exceptionally bright young man from down the street, with absolutely no one harboring even the slightest suspicion regarding his incredibly dark heritage. Even those who shared decades of intimate friendship or embarked on leisurely vacations with him could never have possibly fathomed that he secretly bore the most universally condemned surname of the 20th century. He nurtured a burning ambition to eventually join the premier Federal Investigative Bureau, a dream likely fueled by the thrilling tales of his father's wartime experiences. Following a brief professional stint managing a commercial vehicle rental agency, he successfully infiltrated the highly selective investigative division of the National Revenue Service. Tragically, he became the very first operative within that specific branch to lose his life while actively performing his sworn duties. The catastrophic incident unfolded during a routine transit between two high-stakes financial investigations. An oncoming vehicle suddenly veered across the dividing line, resulting in a devastating head-on collision. He was merely 32 years of age. His sudden, tragic passing delivered a deeply crushing psychological blow. The local parish overflowed with grieving neighbors, devastated colleagues, and lifelong friends. His honorable name was permanently inscribed upon the solemn official governmental memorials situated in the nation's capital and in the state of Georgia, serving as a lasting tribute to his dedicated public service. For his grieving mother, the agony was unimaginably compounded. She had laid her devoted husband to rest just 2 years prior, and now she was forced to bury the specific son who mirrored him the most, not merely in his physical appearance, but in his fierce, unyielding determination to carve out his own unique destiny. With his tragic passing, the singular, realistic possibility of shattering the family's unspoken, tragic pact, the solemn vow to actively prevent the continuation of their bloodline, was permanently extinguished. According to those who shared his closest confidences, he was the only sibling who harbored the genuine desire to challenge that restrictive familial mandate. But cruel fate brutally denied him that opportunity. One of the most profoundly enigmatic individuals within this complex familial web was the dictator's older half-brother, the very grandfather of those final American descendants. This older sibling never successfully secured a position of meaningful influence within the tyrannical regime, and his interpersonal dynamic with his infamous younger brother remained, under the absolute best of circumstances, deeply strained and intensely distant. The supreme leader actively avoided integrating him into any political machinations and explicitly denied him any authoritative role within the governmental structure. Nevertheless, during the turbulent 1930s, this older half-brother somehow managed to establish a bustling culinary establishment situated within the highly sophisticated western district of the nation's capital. Although the supreme leader openly and vehemently disapproved of his sibling operating a commercial enterprise in such a highly visible, elite location, the venue, in a twist of profound irony, became an incredibly popular gathering spot for high-ranking political loyalists. On the building's exterior facade, the proprietor's first name glowed brilliantly in massive neon illumination, while the highly recognizable infamous family surname was displayed in barely perceptible, minuscule lettering. Countless patrons would eagerly wait outside the establishment for hours on end, desperately clinging to the faint hope that the supreme leader might make a sudden appearance, yet he never once crossed the threshold. Following the devastating conclusion of the global conflict, this half-brother desperately attempted to vanish amidst the smoldering ruins of the militarily occupied nation. He swiftly adopted an incredibly generic alias and frantically tried to blend into the massive waves of displaced civilians. But he was ultimately apprehended near a major northern port city by advancing British military forces after authorities discovered he was carrying highly fabricated identification documents. He remained under the strict, watchful custody of the 21st Military Division for several highly tense weeks, subjecting him to rigorous interrogations. During these intense investigative sessions, he reportedly confessed that his notorious surname had brought him infinitely more misery than actual privilege, and that his powerful younger brother, rather than harboring any familial affection, was deeply humiliated to be biologically connected to him. The investigating military authorities, following a thorough examination of his past, issued a public declaration stating that the older sibling did not appear to have participated in any of the regime's horrific administrative actions, and that he had instead demonstrated genuine, profound terror at the mere prospect of being linked to the era's darkest atrocities. Shortly thereafter, he filed a formal legal petition to permanently alter his family name, firmly asserting that his original identity had subjected him to endless cycles of intense hostility and deep suspicion. However, emerging historical accounts later suggested that his actual role might have been considerably more ambiguous than he was willing to admit. Throughout the duration of the conflict, persistent rumors circulated, suggesting that the older half-brother had occasionally acted as a physical decoy for his globally recognized sibling. Capitalizing on a remarkably similar facial structure and an identical style of facial hair, he allegedly donned the supreme leader's iconic military uniform and confidently stepped onto the expansive balcony of the majestic Alpine retreat to graciously accept the roaring adulation of the gathered masses, skillfully deceiving the spectators into believing they were gazing upon the dictator himself. While these astonishing testimonies have never been definitively verified by mainstream historians, they vividly illustrate the staggering level of chaotic confusion that the dreaded surname generated, even among the very members of the dictator's inner circle. The half-brother, who consistently maintained that he had not laid eyes on his younger sibling since their distant childhood years, quite possibly fueled this bizarre mythological narrative just as fiercely as he attempted to escape from its crushing shadow. As the long years slowly passed, and perhaps finding solace in the belief that the relentless march of time had finally begun to erode the darkest layers of that historical stigma, he cautiously began to display a more forthcoming attitude regarding his notorious surname. By the chilly month of November in 1953, he completely abandoned any effort to disassociate himself from his familial past. Operating under the slightly altered alias of Hans Hiller, he managed a local tavern in the southern German city of Munich. In a remarkably brazen move, he decided to publicly protest against a newly released cinematic documentary that featured private, candid footage of the dictator's longtime female companion. The foundation of his formal complaint was absolutely extraordinary. He vehemently argued that the production dishonored the sacred dignity of his family's surname, acting as though it were a legacy still worthy of fervent defense. Shortly thereafter, his undeniable connection to that dark political ideology became even more blatantly apparent. In the year 1955, he assumed the leadership role of a miniature, ultra-nationalist political faction named the National Democratic Party, an organization that was politically insignificant, yet symbolically deeply disturbing. Operating directly from a public house in the northern port city of Hamburg, he shamelessly peddled photographic postcards bearing the likeness of his infamous younger half-brother to visiting foreign tourists. Entirely devoid of any genuine remorse, he appeared to have forcefully reverted to idealizing the very man he had spent years claiming he desperately wished to forget. Although certain journalistic publications erroneously reported him as still drawing breath as late as 1968, his closest surviving relatives maintained that he had quietly passed away in 1956, drawing his final breath in complete silence, far removed from the glaring public spotlight. The ultimate fate of his offspring, a son named Heinz, born from a subsequent union widely considered illegitimate, proved to be equally tragic and grim. This younger relative fought on the brutal Eastern Front during the devastating Second Global Conflict, eventually falling captive to advancing Soviet military forces and perishing miserably while enduring harsh imprisonment. While the older half-brother aggressively attempted to carve out a profitable path in post-war Germany, deeply entangled in highly questionable commercial ventures and barely concealed ideological nostalgia, the dictator's full-blooded sister Paula provided an entirely contrasting perspective regarding the internal dynamics of their household. When subjected to intense interrogation by American military personnel in the sweltering month of July in 1945, she narrated a life profoundly defined by immense emotional distance, crippling detachment, and the complete absence of any solid, loving bonds, even among close siblings. She was brought into the world in the rural Austrian settlement of Hartfeld on her father's agricultural property. She was merely a young child when she suffered the devastating loss of her mother, a profound tragedy that, according to her vivid recollections, deeply scarred both herself and her older brother. Following that heartbreaking event, her brother permanently abandoned their family residence. Being precisely 7 years her senior, they had essentially inhabited entirely separate universes since their earliest childhood. While he pursued his education in the distant region of Steyr, she matured in profound, absolute solitude. They never engaged in joyful childhood games nor shared intimate personal confidences. According to her testimony, her older brother routinely arrived home well past curfew and endured harsh disciplinary measures on a near daily basis. Following their mother's tragic demise in 1907, he permanently severed his physical ties to the family homestead. His younger sister would not receive a single word from him for well over a full decade. She lovingly penned a letter to him in 1910, yet it was met with absolute deafening silence. When they finally crossed paths again in 1921, he coldly justified his prolonged absence. He bluntly stated that he possessed absolutely nothing of value and, consequently, could not offer any tangible assistance. Nevertheless, he did voluntarily relinquish his legal portion of their shared inherited pension, ensuring she possessed the necessary financial means to continue her academic studies at a dedicated academy for young women. According to her personal account, that long-awaited reunion was surprisingly cordial. He even graciously escorted her on a shopping excursion. a rare gesture of kindness she remembered with genuine fondness. In 1922, they briefly reunited once more to pay their respects at their parents' final resting place. Afterward, their paths permanently diverged. He charted his course toward Munich, while she remained anchored in Linz. In 1923, now deeply entrenched in aggressive political maneuvering, he briefly received her once again, but all subsequent encounters grew increasingly sparse. On one isolated occasion, he formally invited her to Munich. On another, she quietly attended the massive party rally in Nuremberg, but she was provided with standard ordinary admission tickets, precisely like any other anonymous attendee in the vast crowd. Throughout the numerous subsequent years, their interpersonal contact was virtually non-existent. Between 1929 and 1941, their paths crossed on merely a handful of occasions, once in the Austrian capital, once in Berlin, and perhaps one or two fleeting encounters in Munich. His written correspondence consisted of incredibly brief, highly sporadic letters, frequently accompanied by basic care packages containing essential provisions such as cured meats, baking flour, or refined sugar. She steadfastly maintained her deep religious convictions and purposefully kept herself entirely alienated from her brother's toxic political environment. Although she received formal invitations to relocate to the luxurious alpine fortress of Berchtesgaden, she consistently declined the offer, consciously choosing to maintain a remarkably modest, completely anonymous existence within Austria's borders. In her public interactions, she adopted the discreet alias of Frau Wolf, a direct, non-negotiable instruction from her brother relayed during the international athletic competitions held in Garmisch. He adamantly insisted that she must remain completely hidden from the public eye. She obediently complied without uttering a single word of protest. After losing her clerical position at a Viennese insurance firm strictly because of the incredibly heavy surname she carried, she quietly accepted a monthly financial stipend directly managed by the Central Administrative Chancellery of the regime. During her extensive interrogations by Allied forces, military officials specifically mentioned the existence of those notoriously brief letters dispatched by her brother. She did not display the slightest hint of surprise. She candidly confirmed, without any hesitation, that he never possessed a genuine functioning sense of familial duty. Even during moments of profound intimacy, he remained an incredibly distant, icy figure, behaving as though deep emotional bonds were a heavy, bothersome burden rather than a source of genuine comfort. During the chaotic final days of the collapsing regime, military operatives located her at her modest residence, situated between Vienna and Linz. Without any prior warning, an official government vehicle arrived, carrying strict orders to immediately transport her to the Alpine fortress. She never discovered exactly who authorized this sudden transfer, though she strongly suspected the powerful party secretary Bormann. She was abruptly housed within a requisitioned hotel heavily controlled by party loyalists, where absolutely no one was aware of her true identity. She consumed her meals in total isolation within her room and did not participate in a single social gathering. Even within that heavily guarded compound, her presence remained entirely invisible. She was never once invited to the main residence, nor did she ever share a dining table with the high-ranking architects of the regime. She laid eyes upon his longtime companion only once, during a massive public rally in 1934. Her brother essentially never spoke of her. His inner circle, although projecting a facade of extreme closeness to external observers, maintained an absolutely impenetrable, icy wall, even against those who shared his very own blood. She deeply understood this harsh reality and, over the long years, had painfully learned to expect absolutely nothing from him. Many long years after these historic events concluded, deeply buried secrets continued to cast a heavy, suffocating shadow. One of the absolute darkest chapters in the family's turbulent history centered entirely around Angela's daughter, the Supreme Leader's direct biological niece. Affectionately known as Geli, she represented significantly more than a mere domestic presence within his Munich residence. According to those who intimately observed their dynamic, she served as the absolute emotional epicenter of the rising dictator's life during his aggressive ascent to supreme power. On the 14th day of September in 1931, at the remarkably tender age of 23, the young woman was discovered lifeless within the lavish apartment she shared with her uncle. The lethal instrument, a personal firearm belonging to the future leader himself, rested ominously upon the floorboards. A hastily scribbled, unfinished letter lay abandoned upon a nearby table. The official narrative was swiftly broadcast. She had tragically taken her own life. Yet, from the very first moment, the grim incident was deeply shrouded in glaring contradictions, whispered rumors, and an overwhelming atmosphere of brutal censorship. The subsequent narrative, aggressively promoted by his nephew, William Patrick, years later, would only serve to intensely amplify these lingering suspicions. Throughout his extensive speaking tours traversing the United States and Canada, the nephew consistently highlighted this devastating tragedy as the most deeply chilling evidence of his uncle's true monstrous nature. During a highly publicized engagement in Toronto, he escalated his rhetoric to a direct accusation, firmly asserting that his uncle maintained an entirely inappropriate, highly toxic relationship with his niece, a bond heavily defined by suffocating jealousy, absolute control, and brutal violence. He publicly claimed that his uncle violently lost all self-control upon discovering a rumored romantic entanglement between the young woman and her private music instructor, leading to a catastrophic physical altercation that ultimately resulted in her untimely demise. According to his highly controversial version of events, it was the powerful aviation minister Goering who secretly orchestrated the rushed burial proceedings and ruthlessly enforced the official public narrative. The future supreme leader was conveniently absent during the immediate aftermath. However, these disturbing rumors were not exclusively confined to the nephew's highly sensationalized public speeches. Within the allegedly penned memoirs of Bridget, a significantly more graphic and deeply disturbing account was detailed, a narrative supposedly relayed directly by Hedwig, the older half-brother's second wife. This specific testimony meticulously reconstructed the agonizing final hours of the young woman's life with highly dramatic, terrifying details. A violent nocturnal argument, piercing screams echoing through the halls, a violently slammed door, and the young woman's body agonizingly slipping away, while only the future leader and his trusted personal physician remained present in the room. When her deeply devoted mother, Angela, frantically returned to the residence, she was physically barred from entering the tragic scene. Only when it was irreversibly too late was she permitted entry, discovering her brother entirely collapsed in despair, allegedly openly confessing that he was a brutal murderer. It was Goering, according to this account, who immediately intervened, aggressively correcting him by stating she took her own life, demanding that this must remain the absolute truth. However, other prominent voices from deep within the family's inner sanctum vehemently dismissed even this elaborate cover-up narrative. Paula, during private conversations with Bridget, aggressively rejected the persistent rumors of a concealed pregnancy, labeling the entire concept a highly convenient fabrication utilized to justify a fabricated narrative of severe depression. Her personal assessment was fiercely unyielding. It was absolutely not an act of self-harm, nor was it a tragic accident. In her firm belief, her brother harbored a deeply toxic, obsessive romantic attachment to the young woman, and this suffocating obsession ultimately drove him to act with a terrifying level of violence that even Angela, who perpetually manufactured excuses for his horrific behavior, could not possibly justify. In her exact words, the devastating tragedy was the direct result of a profoundly unhealthy bond, the cowardly silence of those who possessed the truth, and the unwavering, unconditional protection that his older sister continued to provide him even after such an unspeakable act. The explosive narrative that William Patrick aggressively broadcast regarding the tragic demise of the young woman did not emerge from a complete vacuum. Although his public testimony was heavily scrutinized by many contemporary observers as a crucial component of a highly calculated propaganda strategy deployed during his North American tours, over the passage of time, other credible voices emerged that corroborated, at least partially, his deeply disturbing claims. One such critical voice belonged to Ernst Hamstengel, the former international press secretary for the rising political party, and one of the remarkably few individuals who intimately cohabitated with the future dictator prior to his total consolidation of absolute power. While living in forced exile in London in 1937, this former confidant received a highly unexpected visitor, Bridget. In his published literary work documenting those forgotten years, he explicitly recorded that she relayed a specific narrative that was widely acknowledged among the closest familial members. According to this account, the young woman had become pregnant by a youthful Jewish art instructor whom she had encountered in Linz. The young woman desperately wished to enter into matrimony with him, and this deeply forbidden desire served as the fatal catalyst for the catastrophic conflict with her highly controlling uncle. Through the analytical lens of this former press secretary, the horrific event was not merely a profound personal tragedy, it represented the definitive, catastrophic, psychological breaking point in the future dictator's underlying character. In his detailed analysis, her tragic death marked the undeniable genesis of an absolute, irreversible transformation. That specific bond, which he characterized as entirely unique within the dictator's deeply stunted emotional life, functioned as a crucial psychological release valve, effectively channeling his intense, highly volatile, nervous energy. Following her violent demise, that immense psychological tension never again found an appropriate outlet and subsequently mutated, according to his professional assessment, into increasingly cruel, deeply sadistic, and highly self-destructive behavioral patterns. The subsequent long-term relationship with his final companion, in his expert opinion, never even remotely approached that same profound level of emotional intimacy. He dismissively described her as a mere decorative presence, utterly lacking any genuine influence, and pointedly noted that from that specific tragedy onward, the leader spiraled entirely into a state of profoundly sterile, terrifying narcissism. Within this highly complex historical context, numerous modern researchers have strongly suggested that the drafted manuscript of the memoirs attributed to Bridget might have actually functioned as an integral component of that precise, covertly funded psychological warfare effort, which was subsequently abandoned once it was no longer deemed a critical strategic priority. A highly classified memorandum directed to the powerful director of the Federal Investigative Bureau explicitly confirms that this former press secretary was specifically assigned to sensitive tasks directly related to the meticulous development of psychological profiles and the strategic dissemination of highly damaging information designed specifically to critically undermine the public image of the hostile nation's leadership. Simultaneously, another highly confidential document indicates that he was placed directly on the official payroll managed by Donovan, the intelligence operative tasked with meticulously coordinating the specific narratives that would be aggressively utilized in covert influence operations deeply within enemy territory. Despite the immense historical value of these complex testimonies, once the massive global hostilities finally ceased and a relentless wave of new historical inquiries emerged, the elusive nephew was simply no longer available for comment. He had successfully evaporated from the glaring public spotlight. Not a single soul possessed the knowledge of his exact whereabouts, and his once prominent personal narrative gradually dissolved into the mists of time. All that ultimately survived were highly fragmented accounts, disconnected puzzle pieces, and a lingering familial controversy utterly lacking any definitive closure. Another profoundly controversial and historically unresolved dilemma shadowing this dark lineage revolves entirely around their immense financial heritage. Although the supreme leader exerted tremendous public effort to appear completely indifferent to material wealth, the intricate management of his private finances revealed a starkly contrasting reality. The tale of a ruler who hoarded not exclusively political authority, but also staggering economic capital of truly colossal proportions. For countless decades, the globally accepted image portrayed an intensely ascetic figure, fully surrendered to the nation-state, completely lacking any personal economic desires. He purportedly traveled without carrying physical currency, resided within an aura of meticulously calculated modesty, and firmly declared that all revenue generated from public addresses flowed directly back into the party's treasury. However, lurking behind that carefully constructed theatrical facade, the actual ledgers revealed a vastly different truth. The dictator had officially registered his primary Alpine estate under the institutional ownership of his political organization, a highly calculated maneuver that severely complicated any direct claims on the property in the aftermath of his downfall. Following his demise, the regional government of Bavaria officially assumed legal ownership of the expansive estate and, simultaneously, seized absolute copyrighted control over his notorious political manifesto, effectively prohibiting its republication for many long decades. This strict editorial blockade finally concluded in the year 2016, precisely when the 70 years of standard protective copyright under national law officially expired. Yet, peering beyond the realm of literary control, the most astonishing revelation was the incredibly complex paper trail of his personal wealth. According to prominent historical researchers, the tyrannical leader managed to quietly accumulate an unbelievable fortune exceeding 1 billion imperial marks, a staggering sum that would easily surpass 4,600 million euros in modern economic valuation. A massive portion of this wealth originated from highly unusual, yet ruthlessly efficient revenue streams. He had legally trademarked his own facial likeness, ensuring that every single postage stamp sold bearing his image generated a steady flow of personal income. Furthermore, despite his constant public assertions of total ignorance regarding the final destination of his fundraising efforts, the massive financial current inevitably pooled directly into his private, heavily guarded accounts. The official financial auditors of the regime never ceased raising deeply uncomfortable questions. They desperately sought to uncover the final destination of the massive ticketing revenues, the endless corporate donations, and the immense literary royalties. Nevertheless, the supreme leader considered his supreme authority to exist far above any standard accounting requirements. He consistently proclaimed that all collected funds belonged exclusively to the national movement, and that he personally received absolutely nothing. In practical reality, however, the supposed legal firewall separating his institutional duties from his private wealth was an incredibly convenient, functional illusion. He essentially was the party. By the year 1944, even the most highly conservative economic estimates solidly positioned him within the ranks of modern billionaires. Despite this, the most profoundly baffling aspect of this historical mystery is that a massive percentage of this unbelievable fortune remains completely unaccounted for. There are absolutely no detailed, surviving ledgers documenting the massive dispersal of funds following the catastrophic collapse of the regime. Numerous investigative theories propose that substantial portions of this unimaginable wealth were deeply buried within heavily encrypted financial accounts housed inside Swiss banking institutions or similar opaque international structures. Yet no definitive investigation has ever successfully tracked these missing assets with absolute certainty. Behind strictly closed doors, the leader maintained an iron grip over his immense capital. Historical experts firmly assert that he not only relished absolute political dominance, but also fully indulged in the massive economic privileges that accompanied such power, even if he rarely exerted direct physical effort to generate them. The ceaseless torrential influx of revenue originating from his manifesto, his personal image rights, and immense corporate contributions ultimately birthed a private fortune that remains incredibly difficult to accurately quantify today. One of the most astonishing historical discoveries emerged directly from classified American intelligence archives. Highly confidential military documents dated 1944 explicitly detailed the existence of a heavily guarded, clandestine bank account situated in Switzerland, secretly established on his behalf by the chief publishing executive of the regime, the man tasked with overseeing his massive literary empire. Within this hidden vault, immense foreign royalties, generated by his notorious book were continuously deposited, sums that, if adjusted for modern inflation, would easily approach 300 million euros. This explosive intelligence dossier, meticulously compiled by the Strategic Services Office and explicitly titled Objectionable Activities by Switzerland on behalf of the regime, clearly identified this specific financial account within a prominent banking institution in Bern as an incredibly vital mechanism for secretly funneling foreign currency generated far beyond their national borders. This targeted investigation constituted a crucial component of a significantly broader international initiative designed to track down the immeasurable wealth aggressively plundered during the conflict, which included staggering reserves of precious gold bullion valued at over $5 billion during that specific era. In stark contrast to these truly colossal estimates, the official financial figure formally recorded by the victorious Allied forces following the utter defeat of the regime was shockingly negligible, a mere 50,000 euros in officially confiscated personal properties. The overwhelming majority of his private financial reserves, assuming they still physically existed, had completely vanished into the ether. During the agonizingly final days of his existence, he hastily authorized a last will and testament containing an incredibly vague, fleeting reference to his surviving siblings. Decades later, this ambiguous legal phrasing provided a potential, highly controversial avenue for fierce inheritance disputes. Certain legal scholars argued that his direct living relatives might potentially possess a valid legal foundation to formally demand a percentage of the massive financial royalties generated by his literary works, particularly following the ultimate expiration of the restrictive copyright laws. The bitter fight for an infamous inheritance. One of the most highly publicized efforts in this deeply controversial direction was spearheaded by his nephew, the son of his older half-sister. This specific relative bore such an uncanny, striking physical resemblance to the dictator that he allegedly served as his official bodily decoy during various public engagements. Having been captured by advancing Soviet military forces during a catastrophic winter siege, he endured many brutal years as a prisoner of war before finally securing his release in the 1950s. Once granted his freedom, he aggressively aligned himself with a small collective of surviving relatives, all heavily advised by a prominent historical researcher, with the explicit objective of legally claiming the massive, uncollected royalties derived from the notorious manifesto. However, this highly controversial endeavor spectacularly collapsed when bitter internal disputes erupted. According to numerous contemporary testimonies, the nephew aggressively demanded to retain half of the total potential financial windfall for himself, a greedy stipulation that instantly shattered the fragile alliance. He eventually passed away in 1979, leaving behind a highly toxic dispute that never successfully reached the judicial courts, yet perfectly highlighted the profoundly uncomfortable, lingering echo of that dreaded surname, even among those individuals who had lived entirely marginalized from the actual halls of power. This completely unsuccessful initiative was soon followed by other, equally futile legal attempts. The solitary sister of the fallen dictator, who formally attempted to submit a legal financial claim, was the very sibling who, during those tumultuous years, existed under the fabricated alias we previously mentioned. She officially presented a formal legal petition before a regional judicial court situated in Munich, desperately seeking to be officially recognized as the primary legitimate heir, but her controversial case was immediately dismissed. The presiding magistrates firmly determined that the hastily drafted will completely lacked fundamental legal validity due to severe formatting errors. Furthermore, according to the prevailing legal statutes forcefully enacted within the region, all material assets connected to the highest-ranking officials of the fallen regime had been permanently, irreversibly confiscated under a sweeping general mandate issued in 1948. High-level officials from the regional financial ministry explicitly clarified to historical researchers that this absolutely categorical mandate did not merely target physical real estate. It explicitly encompassed any and all financial revenue stemming from lucrative publishing rights. The judicial ruling was absolutely final and entirely irrevocable. Neither she nor any other surviving family member could ever legally aspire to obtain the slightest economic benefit from any concept remotely connected to that highly toxic legacy. Simultaneously, operating across the vast Atlantic Ocean, the exiled nephew and his devoted wife discreetly sought professional legal counsel regarding the mere possibility of initiating a similar claim. They fully understood that, from a strictly technical legal standpoint, they firmly ranked among the absolute closest living biological relatives. However, they ultimately wanted absolutely nothing to do with the entire ordeal. In their deeply held moral view, any conceivable attempt to financially profit from that cursed surname would be morally equivalent to willingly accepting deeply tainted wealth derived from immeasurable suffering. Even when they briefly entertained the creative concept of publishing an original literary work, extensively utilizing highly exclusive, never-before-seen family photographs and intimate personal recollections, they quickly, permanently abandoned the entire endeavor. They wisely concluded that absolutely no amount of financial compensation could ever possibly justify the terrifying public exposure and the catastrophic psychological toll such a project would inevitably demand. The absolute final members of this direct ancestral line, although they had long since completely shed the notorious surname, were the offspring of the dictator's older half-sister. Out of her 3 children, only 2 successfully survived into their adult years and established families of their own. Each of them produced a solitary male heir. The first, born in 1931, built a quiet career as a civil engineer within his native country and ultimately entered his retirement years without leaving behind any known offspring. The second, born much later in 1945, has continuously existed entirely hidden from the intrusive public lens. According to multiple trusted local informants, he too never produced any heirs. Within a deeply traumatized family that had spent countless decades desperately hiding behind fabricated identities, actively dodging public exposure at all conceivable costs, it seems almost completely unfathomable that there are specific individuals who aggressively pursue the exact opposite outcome, deeply desiring to be voluntarily associated with the most universally reviled, infamous historical legacy of the 20th century, while the authentic, legitimate descendants residing within the United States existed under heavily guarded, assumed names, constantly terrified of the sudden arrival of dangerous political extremists who still idolize the monstrous figure of their ancestor. Completely different individuals, scattered across various corners of the globe, proudly and loudly proclaimed themselves to be the direct rightful heirs. One of the most widely circulated and highly controversial cases involved a French railway employee who, right up until his passing in 1985, aggressively maintained that he was the unrecognized, illegitimate offspring of the supreme leader. This highly sensational narrative, according to his own detailed account, supposedly originated during the first massive global conflict, specifically in the year 1914, when a remarkably youthful corporal serving within the foreign military allegedly crossed paths with a 16-year-old local girl during a brief military leave in a northern provincial town. What subsequently transpired, the man fervently claimed, was a highly irregular, secretive romantic entanglement characterized by fleeting encounters across various rural regions. The supposed outcome of this forbidden union was his birth in the damp month of March in 1918. The official identity of his biological patriarch was completely absent from all municipal civic registries. The fading documents merely referenced an entirely unknown, anonymous foreign soldier. The child was subsequently raised by his maternal grandparents and eventually formally adopted, a legal maneuver that conveniently explained his completely different surname. He adamantly swore that he had traversed his entire childhood entirely oblivious to his true dark origins until his fading mother, lying upon her final resting bed in 1948, shockingly confessed the true, terrifying identity of his alleged father. Although the most highly respected, rigorous historical scholars specializing in that specific era have universally dismantled and completely dismissed his sensational claims, due to an absolute lack of concrete, verifiable evidence. The man never once abandoned his highly controversial narrative. Even his own son consistently repeated these shocking claims to international media outlets, bluntly stating, "I am the direct grandson. The historical evidence is completely undeniable. If the public refuses to believe it, that is simply not my concern." What proved to be infinitely more disturbing than his baseless claims was his highly alarming public behavior. On one highly publicized occasion, he was escorted to visit a notorious historical internment camp, a grim location where more than 28,000 individuals tragically lost their lives between 1940 and 1945. His immediate reaction to this sight of unimaginable horror was deeply shocking. He silently gazed upon the tragic grounds, defensively crossed his arms, and uttered a chilling phrase that instantly froze the entire room. "If my ancestor committed these acts, he surely must have had his valid reasons." On yet another highly controversial occasion, he shockingly performed the forbidden salute during an official gathering within a prominent Asian parliament. However, he was far from the solitary figure, attempting to bizarrely capitalize upon a fabricated connection to this terrifying name. In the recent year of 2019, another individual who also aggressively proclaimed himself to be a direct biological descendant was severely convicted of grave legal offenses and severe moral transgressions, permanently adding his notorious alias to a bizarre, highly disturbing registry of self-proclaimed heirs, whose public profiles wildly oscillated between desperate, attention-seeking self-exposure and profound psychological instability. Absolutely none of these highly sensationalized cases ever provided a single shred of conclusive genetic proof, nor did they ever successfully secure the formal recognition of any highly reputable historical scholars. And yet, their names circulated, actively fueling an incredibly disturbing and profoundly contradictory psychological phenomenon: the desperate yearning to inextricably link oneself with the most universally despised individual of the 20th century, all while his authentic biological relatives engaged in extraordinary efforts to completely vanish from the public eye. The French claimant, absolutely convinced of the highly sensationalized narrative transmitted by his patriarch, did not merely uphold this bizarre claim before the international press. He aggressively transformed it into his personal banner. He fervently asserted that his grandmother had spoken to him of a remarkably youthful dictator who was intensely possessive and deeply jealous, yet also, according to his highly controversial version, surprisingly affectionate and deeply attentive. This deeply unsettling duality between absolute historical condemnation and desperate familial vindication was ultimately summarized within a published literary work, boasting a title that left absolutely no room for ambiguity: "Your father carried the infamous surname." In his desperate quest for biological legitimacy, he eagerly pursued scientific validation, aggressively commissioning comprehensive hematological analyses, consulting professional handwriting experts, and even requesting extensive genetic testing for his very own offspring. Tellingly, absolutely none of these promised scientific results were ever publicly revealed. Independent investigative efforts, prominently spearheaded by a dedicated journalist alongside a meticulous civil servant, provided an entirely unexpected, definitive twist to this bizarre saga. After highly discreetly obtaining a viable genetic sample from the eldest of the authentic brothers residing in Long Island, they meticulously cross-referenced it with verified ancestral genetic material connected to the historical bloodline. The scientific conclusion was absolutely irrefutable. The biological profile perfectly aligned with the established paternal lineage, definitively excluding the French claimant. These dedicated European researchers additionally tracked down dozens of distant relatives scattered throughout Lower Austria. The claimant's genetic signature was entirely absent from that ancestral registry. Despite this undeniable, crushing scientific refutation, he fiercely continued to champion his fabricated narrative. What initially began as a deeply intimate, private family fable rapidly mutated into a highly lucrative media spectacle, entirely sustained by highly provocative public declarations, completely devoid of any concrete, factual substantiation. Simultaneously, An entirely different, equally bizarre spectacle aggressively captured the global public's attention. This involved a man legally registered under that dreaded surname, bearing a prominent feline predator tattoo upon his scalp, and promoting an even more remarkably fragile ancestral narrative. He loudly claimed direct descent from a younger sibling of the dictator's patriarch, even though this supposedly historical ancestor is completely absent from all recognized genealogical records. He audaciously declared himself the absolutely solitary, authentic, surviving heir, completely and openly rejecting the verified existence of the American brothers. Having been raised within a state-run orphanage in Bratislava following his parental abandonment, he constantly asserted that his controversial identity was verbally confirmed by his early caretakers. His daily existence was notably precarious, completely lacking any stable residence or verifiable legal documentation. Yet he remained incredibly eager to broadcast his fabricated truth before any available television cameras. He prominently featured in a major documentary production, stubbornly insisting he possessed absolutely no logical reason to alter his legal surname. In the year 2019, his desperate public exposure took a remarkably dark, sinister turn. He was formally convicted of severe legal transgressions involving an underage individual, despite his pathetic, desperate attempts to minimize the gravity of his horrific actions. Shifting focus far beyond the bizarre realm of these self-proclaimed genetic descendants, there existed individuals who desperately sought a profound, symbolic proximity. A prominent British aristocrat who served as a deeply fervent, highly vocal admirer of the tyrannical regime, remained a completely constant fixture within the dictator's most intimate inner circle for several years. She eagerly attended his massive political rallies, intimately shared private dining experiences with him, and even proudly accompanied him during absolutely critical historical milestones, such as the aggressive territorial annexation of Austria. When the catastrophic global conflict finally erupted, and the supreme leader abruptly ceased granting her personal audiences, her emotional reaction was remarkably drastic. She tragically attempted to permanently end her own existence by discharging a personal firearm within her Munich residence. She miraculously survived the devastating incident, yet suffered from severe, irreversible neurological trauma. She eventually passed away in 1948, remaining under the constant tender care of her grieving mother. Countless decades later, a highly implausible, deeply sensationalized theory suddenly surfaced. According to a controversial investigative article published within a prominent British political magazine, the aristocrat had allegedly returned to her native England carrying a concealed pregnancy, ultimately delivering the child in absolute secrecy within a highly remote, rural medical clinic located in Oxfordshire. The primary source of this explosive rumor, heavily linked to a former employee of the medical facility, firmly asserted that the newborn infant was immediately surrendered to a closed adoption system, and that the young mother consistently maintained that the supreme leader was the biological patriarch. The dedicated journalist who authored this explosive investigation openly acknowledged that numerous critical puzzle pieces simply failed to seamlessly connect. The elite domestic intelligence service never once subjected her to formal interrogation, despite her undeniably profound, highly visible proximity to the absolute highest echelons of the hostile regime. Highly esteemed, globally recognized historical biographers completely, utterly dismantled, and permanently discarded the sensational narrative. Even a remarkably high-ranking official within the national counterintelligence apparatus expressed profound, lingering doubts regarding the official narrative of her self-inflicted injuries. Within his private classified diaries, he strongly suggested that the entire tragic scene might have been heavily, meticulously manipulated to successfully spare her prominent aristocratic family from absolutely devastating, inescapable public humiliation. The highly rumored, deeply concealed child, supposedly born amidst the quiet English countryside, never once materialized, yet the toxic, persistent rumor endured, precisely like so many others. Because if there is one incredibly defining characteristic that inextricably links all of these bizarre historical footnotes. It is the absolute, glaring absence of concrete evidence, the dark, intoxicating allure of the historical myth, and the profound, deeply flawed human necessity, whether driven by political, emotional, or media-driven desires, to artificially prolong a legacy that absolutely should have permanently concluded with the total extinction of the surname. Looking far beyond the ultimate biological or financial destinies, what this incredibly dark narrative truly reveals is the catastrophic, lingering impact of an inheritance so profoundly toxic that its very own legitimate bearers actively, deliberately chose to completely silence it. In stark, dramatic contrast to countless other highly controversial historical figures whose surviving families have dedicated generations to desperately rehabilitating their tarnished surnames, the authentic descendants of this dark lineage deliberately elected to completely vanish. There were absolutely no published memoirs, zero aggressive legal battles, and no public attempts at historical vindication of any kind. The heavy surname, rather than organically generating any form of lucrative symbolic capital, violently mutated into a permanent, terrifying risk, enduring for multiple generations after the regime's collapse. This profoundly active, incredibly deliberate rejection strongly suggests something infinitely deeper: the profound moral realization that certain horrific historical legacies cannot, and absolutely must not, ever be transmitted forward. It serves as a powerful testament that their absolute silence, in this highly specific context, functioned as an incredibly profound act of historical responsibility. The devastating, unseen cost of silently carrying that infamous name, even without ever having committed a single moral transgression, persistently operated as a harsh, inescapable form of permanent social condemnation, completely devoid of any formal trial or judicial sentence.